My name is Shalom, Chalson, and I'm a PhD candidate at the Australian National University in Canberra, and I work primarily on discrimination. I think about what discrimination is and what makes it wrongful. And I'm honored to be able to present my work to you. I'm going to take you through a paper on algorithmic discrimination and social groups. You should have access to a handout, but I'm not going to use any slides. There are two things that I want to achieve in this talk. One, I want to consider a problem for theories of discrimination through the lens of algorithmic discrimination. That is, I want to describe how the role of groups is a problem for such theories using algorithmic discrimination as a case study. Two, I want to suggest that areas of philosophy like social ontology in particular can have something to lend to work on discrimination. Second, notions of social position and social identity and how one is situated, as well as what role one occupies in a social environment, can illuminate some of the concerns in a philosophical treatment of discrimination. I'll proceed as follows. First, I'll briefly introduce you to discrimination. I'll then introduce a particular feature of both the concept of discrimination and anti-discrimination law, which is the presupposition of socially salient groups, to use Caspar Lippert-Rasmussen's terminology. Socially salient groups are groups which structure many of our social interactions or interactions with the social world. I'll then discuss a couple of examples from algorithmic discrimination to motivate the view that social groups are not a necessary condition for discrimination. I'll then present my view and conclude. So what is discrimination? Discrimination generally refers to acts, practices, and policies which treat people differently on the basis of distinctions, like ones concerning people's attributes, where such treatment imposes disadvantage. Wrongful discrimination captures the intuition that it is bad to disadvantage persons in virtue of certain of their attributes. And discrimination can be thought of in a multitude of ways, including in terms of its role in the law or the concept that serves as a way for people like you and I, to make claims about the sorts of harms we face or suffer. Disadvantaging individuals on the basis of their identities or membership of non-voluntary social groups, for instance, can seem unjust. Intuitively, who people are shouldn't be reasons for which they are denied opportunities or dissuaded from choosing one way of life from another. Anti-discrimination law is motivated by this intuition. Discrimination is said to happen to members of socially salient groups. This is captured by the group criterion. Both anti-discrimination law and the folk concept of discrimination agree in this regard. According to Franklin-Thompson, the group criterion is expressed in terms of a prohibited list of attributes, traits, which one may be discriminated in virtue of having, or protected groups where discrimination occurs to members of particular groups, like a race, religion, gender. Thompson notes that reference to the group criterion is widespread in the legal anti-discrimination and philosophy of discrimination literature. But he suggests that there's no good reason for the inclusion of this criterion, and I agree in that regard. For one, the group criterion suggests that a concept of discrimination makes sense only if there are socially salient groups. But I think there's good reason to think that discrimination is a useful concept, whether we appeal to particular groups or not. Thompson suggests that the group criterion does not stand scrutiny and that there's insufficient justification for excluding those who don't fall within a socially salient group from protection against discrimination, something which is in and of itself discriminatory. I think that's true too. I think that something that algorithmic discrimination shows us is that particular practices, acts, policies are ones which we should regard as discriminatory, not in virtue of the extension of those acts, practices, and policies, but in virtue of the kind of treatment that's imposed. And a particular form of that disadvantage, that is, certain traits and attributes which are evidentially relevant to the matter at hand are being used to disadvantage someone, and that doesn't require that the trait or attribute be directly connected to one's membership of a group. So I'll now talk about algorithmic discrimination to help motivate this view. So what is algorithmic discrimination and what are algorithms? Algorithms are rules and instructions for problem solving and tend to involve processing, automated reasoning, calculation, machine learning systems, in machine learning systems, a model is built using a classifier algorithm that learns to sort through data by assessing relationships between features in the training data. These models sort through large amounts of data that would otherwise be too difficult for humans to process. And their use has become increasingly prevalent. So algorithms have been used in healthcare, employment, deciding who gets a bank loan, deciding how much to price someone's insurance premium. For instance, a judge may rule on a longer sentence for a defendant whose algorithmically determined risk score suggests they're likely to reoffend. With the increasing use of algorithms to influence and even make morally weighted decisions, there's been a considerable interest in the potential for these systems to reproduce unfair social structures and to create new paradigms of unfairness. Technological redlining happens when algorithms produce unfair outcomes and perpetuate inequalities, where data sets explicitly leave out social groups as indicators in demographic data on which algorithms are trained. Zip codes could be used as a proxy for one social grouping. And in the case of credit card scoring, algorithms target and market loans to low-income communities, having learned from pre-existing practices. The main problem here is the exacerbation of existing inequalities and learning from data that's got built into it unfair systemic ill treatment. Algorithms are also increasingly personalized because of the large amount of data about specific individuals that they're able to work with, meaning that discriminatory practices can become increasingly specific. So they don't map onto particular groups, particularly socially salient groups. They can produce groups on their own, or they can use increasingly fine-grained specific groups that don't seem to match up with the groups that would fall on a list of protected attributes of protected groups, as the group criterion would suggest. So algorithmic discrimination gives us new ways of discriminating against people, and that seems particularly wrong. It seems like intuitively it still counts as discrimination. There is a salient attribute or feature that's being used to disadvantage someone. And had that individual not possessed that salient attribute or feature, they wouldn't have been disadvantaged. So counterfactually, it seems like there's a disadvantage occurring on account of a feature or attribute. The group criterion would suggest that because it doesn't correlate with a socially salient group, that it doesn't count as discrimination, and I want to deny that claim. So going forward, there are two ways to discuss the problem with the group criterion. One is that it precludes a thick understanding of identity that allows and enables us to see how injustice may be compounded, particularly for people who are situated in the social landscape, such that they are doubly, triply, or multiply liable to an injustice that outstrips that sufferable by most others. So we might have the sort of thing that we want to count as a kind of injustice that would be worthy of consideration by an account of discrimination. It's just that it happens to people who don't fall into the kinds of groups that the group criterion would suggest we care about. Two, the group criterion commits us to a view of groups that's necessary, stable, and can accordingly ground on moral claims. I think a view that takes seriously that discrimination is committed not to groups but to features allows for our normative claims to be generated by the disadvantage condition, by one suffering some objectionable disadvantage, rather than some account of the arbitrariness of the features or the particular injustice of mistreating groups, both of which I think require some substantive view of explanation that must explain how a feature or a group is causally related or unrelated to some decision-making procedure. And we can spare ourselves needing to make this explanation of how some group is causally related to disadvantage that is appealing to the transparency of the process of algorithmic decision-making, which is itself a difficult epistemic task, and just appeal to the degree of disadvantage that's caused, and leaving open the space that some feature is being used against you. That seems to be really important. We don't need to know exactly what it is. So I think talking about the necessary conditions for discrimination would help. Okay. So a bit more on these conditions. The first is that there's a differential treatment condition. I'm again following Benjamin Eidelson in the way that he talks about the concept of discrimination. Differential treatment is everywhere. My wanting an ice cream sandwich rather than an ice cream cone, you're favoring a pea coat over a rain jacket, wanting to have pad thai over som tam. Discrimination as Differential treatment seems obvious. To discriminate is just to treat two objects of comparison differently. One candidate answer to the question, what is discrimination, is mere differential treatment. But mere differential treatment doesn't seem good enough. We need something more than just merely differentiating between things. Rather, something has to be added to this account of discrimination, just as differential treatment, in order to get to the kind of discrimination that we care about. So, and I think that's disadvantage. So differential treatment and disadvantage, and this is something that Eidelson says, together, disadvantages, differential treatment, sort of forms the core features of discrimination. But I want to leave it clear, I want to make it clear that I want to leave the conceptualization disadvantage open. And for the sake of argument, it's useful to discuss a broad carving of disadvantage. There are two kinds of disadvantage that matter: global disadvantage and local disadvantage. Global disadvantage refers to a disadvantage that someone suffers on account of occupying a worse position in a social landscape overall. So one's life outcomes, for instance, are carved off by some decision. Whereas local disadvantage refers to a disadvantage one suffers just with regard to the domain in which a decision is made. Unlike global disadvantage, the scope of local disadvantage is very narrow and it's not broad. With respect to the decision being made, one might not, in fact, occupy a worse off position in the social landscape. One might be made better off, but one suffers a disadvantage with respect to the decision being made. So, say, in virtue of not obtaining employment as a result of an agent's decision, one might end up getting even better employment elsewhere, or one might have lost out on a job that would have been disadvantages to them in the long run. Okay, so we've got differential treatment, we've got disadvantage. We need this third condition that has to do with socially salient features and not socially salient groups. So a definition of discrimination should not be such that all features that may form the basis of wrongful discrimination necessarily entail wrongful differential treatment. Discrimination is context sensitive, and so must include something over and above mere differential treatment or disadvantage. Consider the following case. Suppose that I'm wearing bright blue nail polish. I am not ordinarily a member of a group of bright blue nail polish wearers, but today I am. Take that I'm denied entry to a fashionable clothing store. When I inquire as to why I was denied entry, I'm not provided with a satisfactory response. I nevertheless notice the store attendant's meaningful glance at my hands. Even if we set aside the concern that I may have been treated unfavorably, I am treated differently is explained by an obvious feature. So perhaps the feature that serves as the basis for my differential treatment in this case is one that has really rich social meaning so rich that it does in fact correlate with some socially salient group. So perhaps blue nail polish is taken to be gaudy and unsightly, and those with an animus or prejudice against people with a lower status may be attuned to the connection between the signal, bright blue nail polish, and my being a member of a group that they deem unworthy or needing less favorable treatment, like a lower socioeconomic group. If groups that are socially salient matter because they're socially salient, then we don't have an account for why this and not that group is salient. And that generates claims for redress, since our good reasons for thinking that discrimination and not harm itself is the concept that best picks out the nature of the wrong. It might seem that a project that seeks to number the features that might be safely associated with a domain of social experience, like race or gender, is one that would be misguided because it's not clear that one can establish an exhaustive list. Surely such a list would have to be responsive to objections leveled at a list of protected attributes or groups, and we face an epistemic problem in knowing which groups or attributes to protect. Two, it's not clear that a project seeking to identify these features will ever be successful when what constitutes race or gender differs from context to context. Being labeled in a particular way might be useful in identifying one's racial group, such as my being labeled Indian, or in a place like Singapore, where the label performs the function of prominently marking one's membership of a group. Whether that does indeed track the right conception of racial group, that is, one might identify ethnically as Tamil and not as Indian, and might nevertheless be taken to be Indian, since that's the label relevant for one's interactions with the institutions that confer benefits and goods, And three, such a project is a sociological one and not one that can be theorized abstractly. So those are some possible objections to my view that socially salient features are what counts and that we shouldn't just appeal to a list that we're committed to. But it's not the case we can't, at least to a sufficient degree, identify the features that are generally constitutive of a grouping within some domain of social experience. So this is what I think can happen. I think we can commit ourselves to socially salient features, features that have some social meaning or social import, without committing ourselves to a group. We can still say that some of these features are more important than others. So we can, to a sufficient degree, identify the features that are generally constitutive of an important grouping. So we can take the claim that what matters is socially salient groups, reduce that to the level of socially salient features, but say that we can attribute different levels of importance, moral importance, to the kinds of claims that people can make on account of these features that more closely correlate with groups, without saying that groups are a necessary condition for discrimination. I think this idea has a tight connection with the notion that markers of groupings face a kind of attrition. The markers that are associated with the success conditions of being a member of a group, for instance, can be removed from the original context in which they were connected to some thicker notion of what it is to perform a role or embody a role well. And this is consistent, I think, with some accounts of groups, particularly those of people like Sally Hasinger. Explicit properties can work their way into more implicit properties, and the properties that get targeted shift over time. Some markers of gender and race, as Hasinger says, have tight connections with biological features that gender and race are said to be associated with. But some others have come to take on a certain social meaning through interactions with the dominant ideology or schema that come into play, and that also play the role of a stand-in for the original property that's been replaced by a newer, more implicit one that, according to some ideology or schema, is very important for marking out one's position in society. Markers of group membership may be generated by looping effects, where one's characterization of something in some manner causes it to constitute that thing. That something has been conceptualized in some way has the effect of making it more and more likely that people will behave in a manner fitting of that conceptualization. Markers of group membership are liable to change over time. So this work is likely to involve really complex analyses. If we think discrimination has to do with socially salient features and not socially salient groups, then we say we face a pressing epistemic problem. What are these features? How do we know that features are socially salient? If we stipulate a list, then we need only appeal to the list. But I don't think it faces the damning objection of missing out the cases that are really important. Cases that can be generated by algorithmic discrimination, where the groups that come out of algorithmic discrimination, say newer, more fine-grained groups that don't neatly track socially salient groups in the social world, would be included in our account of discrimination. So we're expanding the notion of discrimination to include cases that should rightfully count, but we're facing an epistemic problem. But the fact that we'd have to run a complex analysis is not a point against what the concept should be. It might seem clear that what we'd have to do is take cultural aspects of the foreground conditions for discrimination very seriously. This account of discrimination takes that discrimination is a social practice. It changes and it conforms to conditions in society and the background norms in which discrimination occurs. Recognizing that discrimination is a social practice would mean enveloping concerns about the distribution of material and conceptual tools. It means drawing attention to who can discriminate against whom, when discrimination can occur, and it calls us to be more attentive to the social conditions in which groups form, particularly through processes and practices like algorithmic discrimination, which can cause new groups to come into existence. But it also means that we have to take into serious consideration what it means for part of your identity to be used against you, what it is to be a member of a group from the inside, where certain features might not be salient from the outside. And that I think is central to anti-discrimination. So in conclusion, I think my account leaves space for a plurality of theories about why discrimination is wrongful, including a plurality of values that might underpin anti-discrimination law. As I see it, the differential treatment condition is uncontroversial. Disadvantage, however, is not. what disadvantage consists in, what goods we are concerned with, and what the right principle is to order a distribution of the equal ascendant of justice. I think these are considerations that leave space for that plurality. But the argument is not to be had whether we should care about this group or that group. It should be, is the feature socially salient? And that's why I'd like to end.